Fine, 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 fine. I will. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. My name is Amali, and I'm the events director here at Books Are Magic. We are so excited to have Betty Shamieh and Margo Jefferson with us tonight to celebrate the launch of Betty's debut novel, Too Soon. Before we get officially started, though, I just have a few logistics to point out for how tonight's event is going to go. First, we will be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of the discussion, so please start thinking of questions to ask and hold on to them. After the talk tonight, Betty will be around to sign and personalize your books at the alcove next to where you checked in. We'll let you know where and when to start lining up for that. And finally, if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we would love to encourage you to buy a copy of Too Soon online using the link in the live stream description. Okay, now let's get into this. This novel is many things. One part family saga, following 3 generations of Palestinian women from Jaffa in 1948 to Detroit in the 70s to Ramallah in 2012. Another part, a gripping love triangle between the young protagonist, a Palestinian-American doctor, and an Israeli theater designer. And another part, a searing piece of cultural criticism analyzing what it means to make art and witness art in times of oppression and revolution. There is so much to discuss in this debut, so let me introduce you to tonight's wonderful speakers. Betty Shamieh is a Palestinian-American writer and author of 15 plays. She's the playwright in residence at the Classical Theater of Harlem. Her 6 New York play premieres include the sold-out off-Broadway runs of Roar and Malvolio, which were both New York Times critics' picks. She is a founding artistic director of the Semitic Root, a collective that supports innovative theater co-created by Arab and Jewish Americans. Betty lives with her family in San Francisco. And as I mentioned earlier, Margo Jefferson joins Betty in conversation tonight. Margo is the author of Constructing a Nervous System, Negroland, and On Michael Jackson. She has received the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Critics Circle Award, the Wyndham Campbell Prize, and the Rathbone Folio Prize. She teaches nonfiction at Columbia University. That's all for me. Please join me in giving Betty and Margo a very warm welcome.
Y'all are from the crowd.
We're going to begin with Betty reading a selection from the book.
All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Part 1. Chapter 1. Arabella, New York City, 2012. It was not that September 11th felt like just another day in New York to me. It was that I had to pretend it wasn't. I was only traumatized by how little I was traumatized. If you're thinking about hating me already, don't worry. You're in great company. Also, try as you might, you can't hate me as much as I hate myself. I had more skin in the game on that day than most New Yorkers who wound up with their skin intact. In other words, I had almost been killed. I was tunneling my way under the Cortlandt Street subway station minutes before it imploded under the weight of the towers, fuel, and human hatred. So, I had been closer to death than my artsy New York intellectual and theater friends, who stared out at the world with eyes bleary with horror at the first public gathering I attended on September 17th. It was at New Dramatists. I was a month into my year-long gig as a director in residence there. In a circle we sat in that unconsecrated church in the heart of Hell's Kitchen to come together as a community. They all looked fearful, anguished, dazed, childlike and innocent, but in that Lord of the Flies kind of way. If anyone was going to be piggy and wind up with their head smashed in, it was clearly yours truly. I was waiting for someone to slip up and exclaim, "What kind of animals could do such a thing?" and then watch all the eyes in the room turn to me. And if that happened, I knew I would snap and spew vitriol of a rather intense nature. Say some regrettable things, in other words, tell the truth. not feeling particularly safe. Surprise, surprise, the world's a fucking terrible place. Innocent people die horrible deaths every fucking minute of every fucking day. I'm painfully aware how easily I could have been one of them. I'm a Palestinian. Yeah. I was born in America. But my parents never really left, and neither can I. When the country you are from no longer exists, you can't ever truly immigrate from it. Give my people a homeland so I can finally ditch it. Give it the big middle finger and pledge allegiance to another flag. Until then, I was born there. I live there, and I can't leave there. Not a day goes by where I don't feel haunted and hunted. Every day is like September 11th to me. Welcome to how I feel all the time. But thankfully, that liberal crowd was careful, measured. They even outdid themselves in their estimations of how much Arab blood was on American hands. Spouting facts and figures I was not politically astute enough to keep in my head. Or rather, I did not have the inclination to do so. I, of course, didn't say a damn word. For fuck's sake, I'm a theater director specializing in postmodern interpretations of Shakespeare. I could recite every major monologue in Hamlet before I could tell you one solid fact about what year, which administration gave what order to bomb what Arab country. But I could probably give you a strong opinion about why. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, there is so much going on within each declaration, each sentence, between sentences. The mood shifts and tonal shifts, and the part that's private and the part that's declamatory, that's boom, boom, boom. It just keeps going, which I love. You start with what's basically a flashback, because the book's in 2012, and so 9/11, sorry.
Yes.
9/11, it's like an alert, it's like an alarm, it's what you can gather, a whole lot of information, emotional information that you're giving your audience. Is it the second chapter that we meet Arabella's grandmother?
Yes.
It is.
Yes.
So, there's what crisis is that?
Well, she's preparing a dinner that will...
Several layers of crises, yes.
She's for a man that she fell in lust with at age 11 in a church. And he's coming to dinner. But it's a fateful night where there's going to be a massacre, and she's going to leave her home. And all she's worried about is this dinner and how to make it beautiful and nice. And when she realizes that she has to leave her home, her first thought is like, but I was having dinner with the man that I wanted to have dinner with. So it's, I hadn't really thought about it, but chronologically, I guess I juxtapose the Deir Yassin massacre, which is kind of like the, I guess the equivalent would be like the 4 little girls in the African American community.
In Alabama, yeah.
You have a sense of like, there's certain things that, there's all sorts of violence, but there's certain violence that just hits a community. And that
this
was
is 1948.
1948, yes.
Yeah.
So people heard about that massacre and ran. So I hadn't really connected that you start Arabella, but I think for Arabella, why she holds on to that moment is she feels alienated from everybody who is shocked by violence.
You mean the 9/11?
Yes, and she carries
that's right.
that with her. And her shrink tells her later in the chapter, you're really sad. And she says, no, I'm not sad, I'm angry. I'm angry. And so she doesn't confront that she actually has grief as a person who lives in this space and, almost died in the 9/11 attacks. So she carries it with her, and she has like kind of a meltdown, which is probably more about her theater career than 9/11, but they all get. But
that,
yes.
It's like the grandmother cooking the dinner for the lover and being very upset when the woman he brings, looks more sophisticated, trying to speak French, which she isn't that good at. This combination, it seems to me that you're you're super at, partly because you're such a good playwright, but that you were really determined to give us is this: I can be petty, I can be trivial, I can be amusingly shallow, I can be winning, I can be self-centered, and a crisis, a world crisis is going to erupt around me, and I'm going to have to cope with it.
Which you wouldn't think would be revelatory, but I find that people read the book and they're like, wow, you guys are human.
Yes,
what?
exactly.
So it's funny to me that, but I think we don't, there is a tendency to, aggrandize one's own suffering, and so I'm very much allergic to doing that. Like, I think it's actually better for you to, like, you can imagine being petty in a war. I can imagine being petty. So to
and
me,
then wisecracking cracking. Did I say crapping? Terrible. Wisecracking wildly. As when you and Aziz, one of the lovers.
one of the Azizes too.
There you are,
There's two.
lusting after each other, and you're wisecracking, and then several Israeli soldiers show up. and
Yes.
then the mood changes, but then you have to find a transitional wisecrack to get from that, the encounter with the soldiers, back to lust and,
Yes.
and pleasure. Yeah.
And it actually cracks something open between them that they, because she is kind of, she's never had a real relationship. And she's at an age where she wants to have a child. So she's never had a real relationship. So in some ways she is a child. So when she has this option that seems like a very reasonable option, who's interested in her, it terrifies her. So she can't relate to him until she has this moment of dislocation with seeing the teenage soldiers with the guns, and it kind of makes their relationship possible in some way.
Okay. Speaking of relationships that are possible or not, we've skipped a generation.
Yes.
Who is Arabella's mother. And when we meet her, she comes into the novel much later. She doesn't come into a part two, and I was interested in that decision. And let me also add, when we first meet her, she's trying basically to divorce her parents.
Yeah.
She's enraged with them. She's gone to a lawyer friend, and she's trying to, there is another word for it, to legally
emancipate herself.
emancipate
She's trying to
herself
emancipate herself.
from
Yes.
from her parents in Detroit.
Yes.
But why did you bring this? It's almost like she's the middle sister
Yes.
in a certain way.
There's a real intellectual way to answer it, and I'll tell you both of them, and then there's the real way. Arabella is much more like her grandmother than her mother in personality. Okay. She's an artist. She's feisty. And the mother is somebody who is a little bit more subdued and stunted, and so initially, Grandma wasn't going to show up. So Grandma shows up, and then Mom shows up, and I don't even know why that happened that way. But initially, it was going to just be Arabella, being mad at the artistic directors in New York. And I was very, I moved to New York.
And doing postmodern interpretation.
Exactly. And trying to break in, because
which is very much that first chapter, too, once you move past.
And I'm not a director. And most people who are not in the theater, the distinction is sometimes lost on them. But there's a very different role between being a playwright and a director. Being a director means you have to be in charge. You have to tell people what to do. You have to cast people. You have to be responsible for firing people. And whereas a playwright can be an ethereal kind of being, you have to actually have a lot of what we erroneously call masculine energy. And I saw the women directors in my coming up with me, and I worked with some of the best directors in New York and internationally who were very young in their careers at the time. The women did not get the same chances, and they were much more likely to be called the B word everywhere they went for just doing their jobs. And so I kind of wanted to pay homage to those women who had broken through in an industry that you are still pay a heavy price for doing your job, which is telling people what to do. So I don't know why I went on this tangent. So that was really fun to kind of herald that, seeing those women try to operate. Because as a playwright, you can kind of just be the mind and not actually directly deal with people.
Yes, yes.
And so I would rather like crawl on the floor if there was glass on the floor than like tell people what to do and force people to do stuff. And I just found that women who were able to do that and break into those fields were very important to me. And I saw that the men, their careers did, you know, they were allowed to fail multiple times, and the women were not. And so I wanted Arabella to kind of pay homage to the person. You know, I am much more similar, I say this often, nobody believes me, but it's true. I'm much more similar to the character of Layla in the American theater world. I'm, you know, a very prominent Palestinian. I'm like, you know, visiting my homeland. I'm doing theater projects there.
Give them a little hint about Layla.
Yeah, so Layla is, she changes her name from Lisa to Layla and kind of exoticizes herself, and she's the
Arabella
frenemy.
keeps calling her Lisa deliberately.
Yes, and she's the frenemy. She's kind of her, you know, and she's the one who kind of ignites this, like, let's go back to Palestine and you know, make theater in a war zone. So, and Arabella is horrible to her, in the way that, you know, I've been horrible to people in my past, not meaning to, but you know, part of being in the theater is working with people and like working through your family dynamics with people, and that's something that, you know, is really fun about writing books. You don't have that many dynamics. You have a few, but not the same level of dynamics.
You've got them on the page because these three generations of women, the grandmother and also the mother, they also are struggling with fierce personalities.
Yes.
Like your directors, wanting to give orders and make decisions and be educated. That's absolutely huge.
Yes.
And they're denied that, and they keep trying to find ways within their families and with a few friends to exercise their will and express their temperaments. So
Yeah.
we see that in triplicate. The other thing that's crucial in terms of the tensions in this book is what the women, I mean, it's a very feminist book. This does not mean that the women do not oppress each other. You know, we know this dynamic. The person, the woman in this case, it can be the man, who is denied something they wanted desperately, and no, they're not going to. They don't have it in themselves to make the sacrifice for the child or the teacher. I know you can have this. I didn't. You can. They say basically, no, you can't have it because I didn't, and you're going to be punished. And that you're very brave about examining this tangled net of love and rage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of love looking at how we let her, you know, because I think the women let each other down, but they let themselves down too in very crucial ways.
That's the first.
You know,
Yeah. You
and
wouldn't
so,
let the others down if you hadn't, at some crucial moment, let yourself down.
so it's you know, it's very interesting. Also, you know, I thought it was fun. My mom grew up in Detroit, and you know, where you know, Black culture was dominant. And so her view of the world was different than, you know, me growing up, you know, on the outskirts of Silicon Valley. And it's just interesting. Like, I also wanted to kind of talk about how there was no space for, you could either be Black or white when my family moved. And Arabella's really desperately trying to be white, and her mother was really desperately trying to be
Black.
So
yeah, and the book is peopled with there are Blacks, there are Jews, there are wasps, there's every kind. There's every kind. I thought, how shall I put it? Yeah. This negotiating. You take on the voice. I mean, you take on the full characters of King Tut. You know, the very, very lovely Black man who works for Arabella's grandparents
until he works
until he becomes a lawyer and then works something else. But
Yeah.
I was interested in I felt no sense of discomfort as you inhabited these very different characters. male, queer, straight, racially very diverse, lots of class stuff of which you are extremely aware among Palestinians, between prosperous Palestinians and their American neighbors, between not prosperous, or even between Palestinians who, as you say, or as Arabella said, I know I come from X generations of peasants in Ramallah. She comes from, whoever it was, comes from aristocracy.
Yes.
So you really are you're giving us that. You're jumping into it. It's very easy to be very anxious about claiming the voice of others, of all the various others. And I'm wondering if being a playwright in some way helped embolden you.
I think
Because you're covering many, many cities, many countries, and many groups of people.
King Tut is the only character who is nice. You know what I mean? Like in the whole book. Do you know what I mean? Like,
his lover gets jealous, but is pretty nice. But you're basically right.
He is nice, but then he's a little
he's not so
snarky.
nice.
Your mom was trying to fill me up in the library. You know what I mean? Like, like you're not living in our space. You know, like
but he's not so pure that
yes.
you don't make him a saint at all.
Yes,
Thank
yes,
God.
yes.
Right.
Whereas and I have felt, I have felt such. How do I say this without sounding like a crazy person? Okay, I'll just sound like a crazy person.
Focus.
I don't think I would be alive as an artist if there weren't for my Black teachers and the Black people who helped me, and when they probably shouldn't have. Do you know what I mean? Like in terms of like, why would you got your own problems, you got your own stuff, and I kind of wanted to pay homage to that, and also like there was an era in the Arab world where like 1/3 of Baghdad before the First World War was Jewish, and there were these like very elegant families in Egypt that were Christian and Jewish and Muslim, and they would all just hang out together because they were the elegant families. Mm-hmm. And I feel like it was such fun to kind of glory in the differences and kind of pay almost homage to the people in my life by giving, that like aristocratic Jewish Egyptian family there, that wrote the Constitution and of Egypt and were the movie stars in the early 1920s, like to kind of be able to like give them voice, and then to give King Tut a voice, who like part of what's so sad about Detroit is if you're an immigrant you could get a loan and a lease,
because King Tut is working in the liquor store,
right,
owned by Arabella's grandparents, and he's he gets himself to law school, but if he hadn't, he'd just be unloading boxes and running errands and being thanked a little churlishly.
And so to me that was one of the things that was shocking to my family's community, having come from the Middle East, that like you could make a lot of money as a Black person but you couldn't live in certain areas of Detroit. That was strange because they fled that kind of segregation. So when they came, what's horrible about racism is you can't buy your way into the neighborhood where nobody wants you. And so one of the horrible things about the Detroit situation was that you couldn't get it would be very hard to get a loan or a lease to start a business in those areas, but somebody could waltz in from Korea or Palestine and get those kinds of and what that does to a community where you're not offered an opportunity within your own community in which you live. So I just kind of, that was something that, my family, the first generation of my family, did that kind of work. They opened little bodegas, like the ones you see here where there's Arabic people speaking behind the counter. Do you know what I mean? Like, and so that was my first generation, and that was an opportunity, even though that was the only, so that was the only opportunity open to them, but that was an opportunity that's not open to somebody who was born in that neighborhood. So, I think being a playwright gave me kind of the balls to like, just be like, you know, because also what's strange about this is I didn't want to write this book, Margo. I wanted to go to LA and make a lot of money and be like the third writer from the left on your, favorite binge-worthy show. And this book erupted out of me against my will, and I think it's hilarious. It was just selected for Book of the Week by People, and if you had told me 10 years ago that 3 generations of Palestinian women would be Book of the Week from People magazine.
People, meeting people, loving people.
You know what I mean? Like,
lovers.
that is, if you had told me that, I would have been like,
Meeting
yeah, and you're smoking what? You know what I mean? Like, so I think that's, I don't know what that means,
So wild.
I walked around New York with a lot of cleavage a lot of the time, hoping someone would fall in love with me so I could be in People magazine, and nobody did. So I wrote intergenerational saga that I thought no one would read, and that's how I got in People. So you just never know.
So what erupted first?
I had a very severe reaction to the needle of the, how like the Empire State Building, they just stuck a needle on top of it. And I love the Empire State Building, and it kind of, when you first come to New York and you're a theater artist, and the Empire State Building is so important. And then someone just stuck a damn needle, and to me, that was like, I had a physical reaction to that change in the New York landscape. And so I realized I felt ownership over the space, and I kind of could mourn 9/11 in a different way, because so it was all the residual stress of holding on to the sense of like, people die all the time. I'm not going to be more affected just because I almost died. People die all the time, and then it's actually, no, you still live in a city, and something as silly as adding an extra light on a landmark building can make you feel dislocated, and like New York can't change anymore. That's how I felt. I can't handle any more changes to my city. Yeah. So that was the kind of, I was like, why am I so worried, or why would I care? And I felt that sense. I feel that sense having, now that I don't live here, like when a restaurant closes, I'm like, oh, do you know what I mean? I can't anymore. So. Because I think you want to crystallize something in time, and I think that some of it was connection to that sense of like, because my grandmother, I took her up to the Twin Towers, Windows on the World, and she was very cheap, so she didn't want to spend the money to like have coffee there, but she wanted to go up. And she's like, oh yeah, and she had an uncle in Ramallah who was simple, and she's like, yeah, he had a building just like this. I've been here. Do you know? Be like, oh, this is not that impressive. She was just kidding, but she named the simple uncle who didn't have anything. But her way of saying like, you can't impress me. So I had a visceral memory of those towers and taking my grandmother there and walking around with her, and I had the sense of like, also, people acting like nobody ever died violently, and having to kind of not.
There was, yes, this naivete of shock and grief and mourning, and it had to have that naivete in a lot of people.
Exactly, and you can't talk to people when they are in shock and grief and mourning. You can't say that this happens to people and people who look like me, and it's just by the grace of God that I'm not in Gaza, and you know what I mean. So I feel that all the time. So
that's what came first, actually. How the book began is
how
it began inside you.
Exactly, and so it was the two silly things: an extra light on the Empire State Building, and my own feeling of like, I live in a city where people don't understand that there's a lot of violence in the world, and the only time it matters is if it impacts maybe somebody they might know tangentially. Like they have no connection to the amount of suffering and violence in the world. And and I'm intimately connected. I feel like every news story could be me. So in the way that I feel like people in 9/11 are like, well, I used to take the Cortlandt Street subway, or I used, that kind of sense of I just missed that, So I realized I carried that, like people watch the news and they're like, oh, that happens and that's horrible. And I'm like, oh my God, I just missed that,
Yeah. But then you thought it was all going to be Arabella.
Yes.
And the the two generations
You know,
emerged?
I wrote about it because I didn't read any Palestinian literature, and during the time, when I started out, there were no Palestinian novelists, Palestinian American novelists or playwrights. And so as I was writing this book, there were novels coming out, and I chose not to read them. And what I realized is some of the major, I shouldn't say most, several books have multiple generations. And I felt like what ultimately happened is I couldn't write a novel about a Palestinian American trying to make her home in the world without contending with the generations behind her having lost their home. So I couldn't talk about Arabella's without talking about what had happened to the people before her and how it did and didn't impact her.
Yeah.
So I was like constitutionally incapable of writing Sex in the City, which is what I intended to write. You know what I mean? So it's like within the first few chapters, the first few paragraphs, I was like, this is not Sex in the City, sorry. This is something else, so.
Though there is sex in a number of cities. But, very different. The tonalities, the circumstances, the context, very different.
And that's what I want the new subtitle to be, Sex in a Lot of Cities.
There we go.
Not in the city and
That's it.
on a boat. You know what I mean?
There we
There's
go.
there's so much.
That's right.
Well, I mean, my favorite thing to write was that sex scene where there was no sex. That was so much fun to write because I remember, being an eavesdropper, an older person, talking about how she didn't understand what was happening with her body. Like some guy touched her hand and she had a reaction.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And she didn't
Yeah.
understand what that reaction was. And I thought it was so funny that she didn't know enough about her own physiology.
But you also complicate it. Everything gets complicated with some observer, some sneak over. The daughter sees it. The
She almost
daughter who
gets-
becomes the mother.
She almost gets tossed overboard too, poor girl.
Yes,
The
exactly.
grandmother was I don't know, I can't be told.
I cannot, right.
There almost was no Arabella. She's
There
like,
you go.
don't interrupt me when I'm holding hands with a man. You know what I mean?
And this
Don't.
is our secret.
Yes, yeah, me
You
and
will
you.
get lots of favors from your mother if we keep the secret. All of which we're going to have to open for questions in a few minutes, but makes me think again of Arabella and her postmodern interpretations of Shakespeare. One thing she says, she by the way directs Hamleta, and plays. But
Just like it's so postmodern and
it's
you know what I mean?
very, very. But you have Arabella say that she her way into these tragedies, because there's Macbeth, there's Hamlet, is to this is my thing.
Yeah.
Treat them. No, I mean I was
Yeah.
being Arabella.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's to treat tragedy like comedy, and that in some way, without their being opposed, seems to me so much what you're doing
Uh-oh.
in this novel.
Well, I
So-
tried.
Yeah, just say a little more about that,
Well,
both from the Arabella point of view and from the Betty. Arabella.
I spent a lot of time in graduate school, in playwriting graduate school, being told, you have to write a drama or you have to write a comedy. And I thought the stupidest thing in the world was to tell an audience, you're going to laugh now, and here's some laughter. The most interesting thing to me is, to bring somebody in and, make them laugh and then, grab them by the heart and then, make them laugh again. So I think Shakespeare does that too. I'm not as you might. It's funny. I wrote a sequel to Twelfth Night, and a book about a chick trying to direct Hamleta, which is a little tongue in cheek. It's it's a little earnest and postmodern this is splashy and we'll get blog posts.
They see
You know what I mean?
Hamlet.
Because how many productions of Hamlet can a human endure? You know what I mean? In their lifetime. You know what I mean? You just can't keep
Can't
watching
do it
Hamlet.
anymore.
So I for me, I wish there weren't jackets on books. I wish there weren't reviews. I wish you walked into a play and you didn't know what the heck you were going to get. And I think part of the thing is, marketing, but I just love having both things in the same world because that's kind of where I exist in, that kind of sense of like, so I like to dislocate. So I like to people to come in and see Othello and then to be like, oh my God, it's so absurd because she does in her postmodern way. Yes, exactly. She does an Othello where the guy is black Irish, which if you go to Ireland is very weird because you're just like, well, okay, you know what I mean? And so to the audience, they all look like white people, and she's making the point that like it's absurd to distinguish between people by their hair color as opposed to by their skin. It's like an absurd thing that we're doing. It's not like there's a consistent thing where there's colors and then we react to them. Like why would, if we're going to be racist, let's be racist against brunettes and blondes. Why do we have to be skin? Like it just doesn't make sense. So she does
It's
this.
random.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's like it's random, and then we give it importance.
Then we make it an ideology. Yeah.
And it's so she does an Othello where everybody looks white and it's a black Irish Othello. Do you know what I mean? So she does these kinds of, and I think in theater you get attention for like taking a classic and doing something funky. You know what I mean? Like, and so so you kind of like try to be funkier every single time. You know what I mean? Like, and that's a trap in itself. So.
Yeah, but you didn't fall into it.
Well, thank you.
And also, it's a nice big novel that the pace never dropped. You give us plenty of time to switch from laughing to I don't like her to oh no, that's my girl. You give us a lot of time, yeah, and then we start living with 3 generations and comparing mothers and daughters to each other, and even the husbands, who are lesser characters. I mean, they're more minor, but
right.
But you give them their due.
Oh.
Every one of them gets a moment of some kind of humanness, even if it's pathetic, or it can't compensate for the bad things they've done, but it's there, and that really matters.
Oh, yeah. Well, I tried.
I think, that it's time for, to open. I was being given the signal. That's what I was responding to. Yes, time for questions. The only thing that I would say, and I'm sure Betty would feel the same, questions are questions, not so much statements with long exclamation points at the end. So think of it as having a question mark and think of it on it and being delivered to Betty, and you're really wanting her to answer it. And now we will.
I just want to say thank you, Margo. It's such an honor to be on the stage with you. I've admired your work so much, so thank you.
It's been a long time.
I wrote this book so she would sit with me. And she did.
Oh, thank you. All right, hands up, hearts open. Yes, I see you.
Hi. I'm curious, did you consider writing the story ever as a play, or rather, what about Arabella and Zoya's story made you say, no, this has to be done in the form of a novel as opposed to play or for the screen?
It didn't feel like a play to me, and I also started it while I was pregnant, and I had moved, kind of dislocated myself from my New York life, and that meant like I couldn't be out watching the latest play, and I was kind of back that trapped little girl who only had libraries to escape into, and so I wrote this book in part for that little girl who was reading the Joy Luck Club, and which was a very important book, I think. And I don't think this book would have been possible if there weren't things like The Color Purple and the Joy Luck Club, kind of to make space for women of color to be center stage in the culture. I don't think I could have imagined that I could write a book like this without that. So I was in a place in my life where I could only get culture in snatches in the way that I could as a child, and I was actually back at the same libraries that I visited as a child. So I wanted to write a book that for little girls like me, who needed this book, and couldn't be in New York at 8 o'clock at night spending $90 on an off-Broadway play.
did I see a hand up?
But you should buy the book even if though you're not a little girl. Just
There we go. Yes.
How soon did you start sharing this with editors? Like, what was your philosophy or instinct around having other ears and eyes on it? At what stages? How many?
Well, this isn't my first novel that I wrote. I wrote a crappy novel because I had a friend who, I told her like the two ideas and she's like, I told her, yeah, there's this story about this Palestinian girl and you know, she's kind of bitter. And she's like, I don't know if that's gonna sell. Try the other thing. And so I wrote a whole novel and I sent it to all the people that I knew who were in the book world. And they were all, yeah, no. So I couldn't get an agent because it wasn't coming from my soul. It was like an adaptation of a play of mine that just didn't work. Because I was afraid to write this novel because one person told me, I think that's going to upset people. And what she meant was, I think that's going to upset me. And it's going to be harder for me to be your friend if that upsets me. And so what I did was I had to really sit with myself and realize that I spent all this time writing a full-length novel that was no good and I needed to take a class. So I took a class at a continuing ed program at Stanford. And at the time I was the playwright in residence in their TAPS in the theater department. So it was really a humbling experience to be like this celebrated kind of artist in residence and also in their continuing ed program that's non-competitive. And I found a teacher and I told her, you're amazing. But you know what I need you to do? I need to send you 500 words a week, and you need to say, good job, Betty. That's all. You know what I mean? You need to read it and say, I really like how you said Arabella, you know, told a guy, you're a motherfucker. You know what I mean? Just like, give me one positive thing, don't say anything negative. And she kind of, like, it was like, you know, Hansel and Gretel and breadcrumbs, do you know what I mean? Like, and so, and I had come to, and I was really trying to break into TV at the time as well. And so I flew here and took a course with a friend of mine. And I happened to have, and her name was Kara Corthran. So also, mind you, I had sent the bad book to everybody I knew in the publishing industry. So when I went back with, I have this other thing, they were like, yeah. And like, you know, like, and so I met somebody from Sterling Lord, and that's how I got my agent, who's here. Mary, hi, say hi, everybody. So had I not, so it's funny, I came here to take a TV writing, because what I realized very strongly was I needed to take courses and I needed to have a beginner's mind, and I wasn't going to break into TV just because I was a playwright or write a novel just because I was a novelist. I had to take courses, I had to humble myself, I had to pay people to read my stuff and tell me good job because I didn't have any friends who would do that. Do you know what I mean? Like, or like I couldn't barter with that. I wasn't here and couldn't make, you know, people come and drink beer and, you know, read my stuff with me in the way that you can in New York. So I flew here. I dropped a lot of money to stay in a hotel to take a course with a friend of mine who was teaching. So like, instead of going on a nice vacation, I came here and took, and had I not gone to that book party, I wouldn't have met the person from Sterling Lord that got me the agency and got me to the one place where I hadn't burned all my bridges with my bad novel. That's a long story. Okay, but it's all to say, what I found was that I had to, it was very challenging for me to have several off-Broadway plays, you know, a lot of stuff in translation, and to fail. And I failed with the first novel that I wrote, and to try again. So that's the story of how I got here.
And to try new ways of making it work. You know, I'll take this course. It's humiliating. I'll do it. You know.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No,
sorry.
No.
She's in charge. Yeah.
You got it.
Great.
Hi.
So I feel like there are so few Palestinian American playwrights, novelists, directors, actors. There's so little representation, and I'm wondering like what your relationship is like to the idea of writing an individual story, but also having a responsibility to be a voice for a largely voiceless people, and like if you have any relationship to like what that feels like for you.
I feel like I got this question a couple book events ago. It's been a bit of a, but and it made me think a lot. I don't think in my writing I do that, but I think in my personal life I do that because I'm usually the first Palestinian most people meet or meet at the same level, meaning they have to contend with me as a person in the world who might be their equal and might deserve human rights. So, I might not, but might, so I feel like even stuff like grooming, manners, how one moves in the world, because you represent something. So I think in my work, it's a sacred enough space that I just kind of let loose. But I feel like, and I have to, be extra charming, be extra funny, be extra kind, to kind of counter the enormous dehumanization of and invisibility of my people. So, I'm happy to say that in my work I don't feel like I have to do that, but I do consciously, and I don't write. I have stories that are similar to The Color Purple that I could write about Arab men, and I consciously, because I'm writing in English and in America, I choose not to write stories that, in my way, reinforce the idea that the men are horrible and the women are oppressed, so let's just bomb them. You know what I mean? Which is how the invasion of Afghanistan started. Yes. You know what I mean? So yes. Exactly. So I actually do the other thing of like, you think that's what we are, and so even though if I was writing for a purely Arab audience, my stories might be different. I'm not, so I'm conscious of that.
Other questions? Yeah, okay. Quiet.
I know.
Meaningful quiet.
Yes.
I would just like to ask why Hamlet became the central play to the book.
My editor! Yay! Can we give a round of applause? It's funny, and some of you may know that there's another novel. That's a wonderful actual novel. It's called help me out. Well, Ghost. Enter Ghost. Yes, yes.
Right.
It's which I thought was hilarious. We sold our books around the same time, so that means we were writing them around the same time. But there's a couple of reasons. First of all, whenever you get funding from European source, it tends to be to do European work. So there's like, we give you unwashed masses Hamlet. And, I was talking on a radio interview with somebody who really loved Hamlet, and she was like horrified that I was like, because she was like, there has to be a bigger meaning than that. And she wanted, and I was kind of making fun of how Europeans, they would never fund a Betty Shamieh translation. And, you know what I mean? They want to give them Hamlet. So I was making a little bit fun of how funding in the arts in the Middle East works. And there are, like, the most translated play is Hamlet, the most produced play in Tunisia, and you know what I mean, Egypt, and all those places are Hamlet. So, you're not reading Macbeth or seeing Twelfth Night, you're seeing Hamlet. And that's how people are introduced to Shakespeare predominantly in the Middle East. But also, it becomes Arabella's big challenge, and it's the big challenge of every director to kind of make their definitive Hamlet. And so even though, and it's kind of that thing of where you think you're making fun of something, you know what I mean? And then you suddenly become in it. That happens to me a lot, where somebody's like, why don't you write a play about honor killing? And I'm like, no. And then I write the play and I'm like, actually, I like this play. You know what I mean? Like, and so that's kind of what happens to Arabella. So, but, and as I was writing it, I was like, oh my God, it's about a lost kingdom. Oh, you know what I mean? Like there were suddenly connections that I even, as I started the book, making kind of a little bit fun of how funding in the arts happens from a place like England to Palestine, of which there was a lot. There were a lot of theater programs, which were translations of Hamlet and productions of Hamlet, and so it's kind of for me the apex of Western culture, and her doing her own spin on it and finding also a real love for it as well. I make her somebody who loves Shakespeare, which I love Shakespeare, but I have You know what I mean? Like it's like kind of like you're supposed to love broccoli. You know what I mean? That's how I feel about Shakespeare. You know, oh God.
And
You
you
know?
know, also she's a woman director.
Yep.
She's taking on Hamlet is like, you know, the quintessential, the brilliant tragic young man in drama. You know, it is.
And all,
and you, so I got to snatch at it. That's what she does.
and I found discoveries too, because I never thought like Ophelia just suddenly becomes a singing, you know, person and falls in a lake. I was like, what is this? A woman would never write this. And then this is so stupid. And then you get into it and you're like, actually, grief can make you crazy. It can make you crazy. But initially, I was like, that's, like I just was like, I was constitutionally like, why does she go crazy?
But the way you wrote, the way you as the director, I
Right.
mean, the character directs the craziness, makes it different. It's generally so lovely,
Exactly.
and so mournful, and so lyric, and that's not what Arabella
Right.
does.
And
yeah.
that's not madness either.
No,
You know, like
exactly.
madness is not pretty. So yes, but I even as me Betty writing and making fun of this funding, I still fell in love in the way that Arabella fell in love with
yeah,
Hamlet,
yeah, good.
which you know
I
surprised
think
me.
one, maybe two more questions. Yeah, one. Oh, yes.
Hi, sorry.
No, no, good.
I was just struck by like, oftentimes, the event that begins the book 9/11, kind of, you know, what happens is that it's so incomprehensible. Like a lot of the things that happen around the world today feel very difficult to write about, not because they're tragic, not because they're, you know, like evil or terrible, but because they're so hard to understand. They defy, you know, logic. And I was just wondering where you begin when you face something like that, to make sense of it, to make it kind of reduce it to this human scale so that you can write about it in a book.
Well, I think like what happened to my family defies logic. Like, you know what I mean? Like they lived for 500 years in a village and then suddenly that village doesn't belong to that country and the maps are like the names. So I think when you live with a sense that like the world doesn't make any sense, you know, just like it doesn't make sense that you would discriminate based on skin color and not hair color. Like that doesn't make sense. If you're going to discriminate, choose. So I think once you look at the world, you know what I mean? Like racism doesn't make sense, you know? So I think I personally always felt that sense of like nothing is, you know, and I think that like sense of connection to how absurd. I mean, also like life is crazy. Like who signed up to be on the roller coaster where you like live as long and you see everyone around you die and then you get off the roller coaster? Like I wouldn't sign up for that ride in Disneyland. Like what is that? What is that? You know what I mean? Like what? Like that's a bad ride. Do you know what I mean? Like, you know what I mean? Like, whereas like everyone around you goes away that you love, and then like you're all what? Like no. So I think once you're in touch with how crazy everything is, then you're like, okay, no more Palestine. You know what I mean? Like things can be different and changed, and that's where they lived for 500 years, but you can't call it that anymore. And you know what I mean? So it's just, I feel like life is that. If you start looking at the elemental thing about how, you know, I mean, we're living in a really crazy time, especially now, but like, I mean, for me, it's like, I still can't, like, I mean, maybe this is not even appropriate, but like, Trump was just on the Real Housewives of Atlanta. He was just there. Do you know what I mean? And now he's there. And like, and so I can't really, you know what I mean? He was just telling Nene, you need a prenup.
Yes.
Like that, like it just doesn't make sense that I have to take what he's saying more seriously than him talking to Nene on the Real Housewives of Atlanta.
Yes.
You know, I like it's absurd to me. Like, which is probably a protective thing because I would probably be Ophelia and running in the street. Do you know what I mean? Like, but so I think that part of, you know, the Palestinian experience, or maybe every experience, is that everything is really absurd. you know, and you just got to get used to the new level of absurdity. I hope that's
So
helpful.
you find a shape for it. You find shapes for it. Yeah, and languages for it. That's, yeah.
Well, I try. Thank you.
Yes, all right. Betty, thank you
Oh,
so
thank
much.
you.
That was so great.
Thank you. All right, guys. Thank you. And thank you to Books Are Magic. Thank you for hosting us.
Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Thank you to everyone who asked questions. Betty, Margo, thank you both for such a wonderful conversation. And if you're still with us on the live stream, thank you for tuning in. You can buy a copy by clicking the link in the live stream description. For those of you with us tonight, you can buy a copy if you haven't already at the front register. As I was just saying, these are crazy times. It's so wonderful to ground yourself in really, really good literature, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. We have a couple copies of Margo's memoir, Constructing the Nervous System, which is fantastic. So I highly recommend checking that out as well. Both reads are so important, this month especially, so definitely grab a copy on your way out. Betty will be around to sign and personalize your books at the table next to where you checked in. My lovely coworkers are pointing right now to where that is.
Thank you to all of you. Yes.
So we're going to ask that you please gather all of your personal belongings, go ahead and line up down the wall, and
Okay.
you'll get your book signed. Thank you all so much. Let's give
Yay.
these two one last round of applause.